vaccine for a young, healthy child. And so I think we need to think about the ways we give out the vaccines and administer them, and maybe the vaccine schedules.
Dr. Tevye Choi, welcome back to Reaganism.
Thanks. I love being at the Reagan Institute, and I love being on the Reaganism podcast.
Well, we love having you on. Of course, you are a senior fellow here at the Reagan Institute. You also serve as a senior scholar at Yeshiva University's Strauss Center. And important for what we're going to talk about today, you're a former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services during the Bush 43 administration. I reference that title from your illustrious career, Tevye, because you wrote a cover story for Commentary Magazine a couple of months ago entitled In Praise of Big Pharma, and it got a lot of attention. You have a knack for sort of anticipating issues, writing on them, and then headlines seem to follow soon after. So you wrote this piece in praise of Big Pharma, and I'm pretty confident within weeks, certainly not months after that, the Trump administration moved forward with price controls on pharma. If I have that right, you can correct me on the chronology. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Tevye, of course, you wrote this book last time we had you on the podcast on the relationship between presidents and CEOs. And since then and now, we've had the all-time epic meltdown between President Trump and Elon Musk. So we're going to need to get your input on that as well. Let's start with the world of Big Pharma and your article in Commentary Magazine. My two takeaways, but I'd love for you to outline them for our listeners and viewers, is one, we need Big Pharma given the direction technology is headed, biotechnology in particular. And two, we're sort of making it a policy here in the United States, both in government and then sort of the actors in our society who attack Big Pharma. They're kind of creating this environment where Big Pharma might not be there, and we should be concerned. Did I get that right? And perhaps give us the framing of this important article.
Yeah, I think you got the framing exactly right. But first, I'd like to just make a comment on my predictive powers. I think I'm going to write my next article about unicorns and rainbows, and hopefully they will show up everywhere.
Yeah, it's about time you did something uplifting for our country instead of anticipating sort of the crashes and meltdowns.
Well, I just write about what I see. In any way, I think you're totally right. The whole piece about In Praise of Big Pharma is a counterintuitive headline these days because everybody seems to like to bash Big Pharma. I talk in the article about how it really started with the trial lawyers, who are the source of many bad things in this country, but it migrated over to Hollywood, the Democratic Party. Every Democratic presidential candidate since Al Gore has bashed the pharmaceutical industry to one degree or another, and it's only gotten more and more frequent with each succeeding presidential candidate. And now it's also migrated to the Republican side of the aisle. You have President Trump trying to impose price controls on them. You have other senators who are very critical of the pharma industry on the Republican side of the aisle. So my take in the article is that the pharma industry takes hits from all sides. They keep getting bashed from everyone in society. And at some point, people are going to say, maybe I don't want to create pharmaceutical products in this country. This country is not a welcoming environment. And this can happen in multiple ways. You can have young students who are graduating college and say, well, I have a degree in biochemical engineering, but maybe I'll use that in the food industry or the fabric industry or the defense industry, anything that is less bashed than pharma.
Well, that wouldn't be so bad. Defense industry would be good. They've been suffering some time. They need some of those geniuses. But I take you on the other two.
And then the second thing is 40% of the workers in the pharmaceutical industry, the scientific workers, are already immigrants. And so perhaps either immigrants won't come to this country to do pharma, or immigrants who've already moved here once might move to a better environment, a more welcoming environment for pharmaceutical innovation. And then in general, pharma allocations are based on capital. And if you think you can make money on a product, you'll do it. But if you think you're going to be trial lawyer to death, sued to death, then maybe you're not going to invest money in that next new cure because you think it's just too risky based on the threat of lawsuits. So all those
go ahead.
Might lead to people saying, hey, maybe I'm not going to invest in this industry, work in this industry, move to the U.S. to be in this industry. And I think right now we're potentially on the cusp of a biomedical revolution where we need this pharma industry to bring these products to market. NIH can research stuff, but they don't actually produce cures. They produce ideas that then can be translated into cures by the pharma industry. We need them.
Yeah, I want to go to that last point you just made in terms of what government does and does not do. In a moment, we should talk about MAHA, which is Make America Healthy Again, led by our Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK. But before going there, Americans, probably, and you write about this, don't truly understand what government does and does not do. You have a great story you tell of LBJ and his assumptions about what, I guess it was NIH or maybe FDA did in terms of, or didn't, pharma, which was not accurate. I mean, this is sort of the basic research, but taking that basic research and then doing the trials and investments to realize this sort of life-saving, innovative medicine that American pharma has produced does not come from government, right?
Yeah, look, the U.S. spends $47 billion on NIH. I'm generally fine with that as long as it's going to actual scientific research and not woke nonsense, or administrative costs at 60 to 80%. But in general, I'm for scientific research. I want to see more of it. But NIH does not produce cures. They're not made to do it. They don't want to do it. It's not their thing. And what they do is they produce ideas, scientific advancements that can then be taken into the world of what's known as applied research. And these pharmaceutical companies are the ones that produce the applied research that create the cures that you and I and your family and your wife even administers on a daily basis. And it is those cures that have really made it so that heart disease is less frequent today. Cancer survival rates are better. You don't have the issue of ulcers. I mean, I'm a big fan of the show The Odd Couple. And in every other episode, it seemed like Oscar would have some kind of ulcer flare-up because he had a taco or a burrito or something. And now we don't have ulcer surgeries anymore. He used to have to go to the hospital to get ulcer surgeries. That doesn't happen anymore. We figured out a way to solve this with pharmaceutical interventions. And I think if we berate the industry and belittle the industry and regulate and try the industry to death, it's not going to be there to create the cures of the future.
Let's talk about cost, because I think one of the things that drives people to be skeptical of a headline that says in praise of big pharma, as commentary headlined your piece, is, are you kidding me? These guys charge so much for their drugs. They fight the generics from coming online. They're making huge amounts of money. Why should I praise those guys? In fact, when they come up with something, and you've spoken about this and you write about this, they kind of sit on it unless they can make maximum profits, or if they have it, they'll want to make you pay prices that are just, from the consumer standpoint, outlandish. And so they just look like some sort of greedy profiteering sector. Why is that narrative not the correct way to view the sort of risks they take as they pioneer in medicine?
Well, I wouldn't say it's completely wrong, but it exists. This phenomenon of these initial high prices exists because that's the way we set up the system. We give them a limited patent window. When these products come out, they are the exclusive ones who could sell the product. And then we say that you can sell it for this period, and then somebody else will come and take your same product and sell it after the 10, 15-year window expires. We also have very long FDA approval periods. That patent window is ticking down across the FDA approval period. We allow for more and more trial lawyer lawsuits, nonsense lawsuits in many cases, although not always. And that takes away profits. And so we're setting it up so that the pharmaceutical companies, in order to survive, have to charge as much as possible in those initial years. The other thing is that the European countries impose price controls on it. So the pharmaceutical companies see the U.S. as the only market in which they can make up the cost, and the costs are upward of $2 billion to bring a new product to market. A lot of that is because of hyper-regulation. So I think with better regulation, more transparency, there are reforms we can do to make the prices more affordable. But one last thing I'll leave you with on this is that generic drugs are cheaper, and the U.S. is much better at providing for generic drugs. So once you get into the generic window, the U.S. actually has lower prices than the European countries.
Oh, interesting fact. I wasn't aware of that. Although the problem with generic drugs, I understand, is that the ingredients reside in China, or certainly a large percentage, and so we ran into that during COVID. But that's interesting on the pricing side. Two things you just said, which I want to follow up on. It deviates a little bit from the article, but goes to the heart, I think, of the sort of issues you're thinking about, Tevi, is price controls, and the fact that one of the reasons why it costs so much is because Europeans mandate these price controls. right? And then now the Trump administration has sought to counter that, looking at that as unfair, that Americans should, in part, subsidize the price controls of the Europeans by paying for the heightened prices that pharma demands of the United States. Where does that leave us, and how does that impact the overall equation for pharma? You get price controls in Europe. Now, ideally, I think what would happen is that the Europeans would break and therefore pay more, which would reduce the pricing in the United States. But the direction I think things are headed based on Trump administration policy right now is we would get price controls here as well. And they're doing that primarily through the entitlement state, right? Which in some respects I'm sympathetic to as someone who would like to see the cost we're spending on entitlements, right? The non-discretionary, the fixed mandatory part of our government spending, which is just eating up a larger and larger percentage of overall federal spending, more than 2/3 of federal spending. So take us through how, on the one hand, we can kind of reduce what Americans pay, right? Somehow address the spiraling costs of Medicare and Medicaid, and at the same time not lose pharma, given its important contributions it makes towards Americans' health and life expectancy and everything else with it.
Well, there's a lot going on in that question. I'm happy to address it. The first thing to recognize is that the response to market interventions is not more market interventions. It's less market interventions, right? So if the Europeans impose price controls, imposing more price controls doesn't solve the problem, it exacerbates it. The second thing is that we absolutely need to control our entitlement state. It's not just Medicare and Medicaid, which people talk about and are a big part of the problem, but there are 100 different entitlement programs or transfer programs in the federal government. They're overlapping. They have weird incentives. They cost a ton of money. We need to get that under control. Ronald Reagan, who is obviously the namesake of this great institute and this great podcast, led to real reforms in Social Security. And I think we could think about the same style of Social Security reforms in Medicare and Medicaid. One thing I would like to see is increasing the age of eligibility for Medicare, because people are just living a lot longer. When Social Security Medicare passed in the mid-19th, when Medicare Medicaid passed in the mid-1960s, the life expectancy was about 65. It's now upwards of 80. And so we need to take that into account. Reagan also pushed forward a bipartisan commission, the Greenspan Commission, so that both parties would have to hold hands and jump in. That was a classic Reagan approach. He did things in a bipartisan way, which is less common these days. So I think those would be good approaches. And then also, I mentioned earlier that I think there's hyper-regulation in the pharmaceutical field. I think we allow for too many lawsuits. We make it too easy to engage in nonsense lawsuits. And I think more deregulation would solve these problems. More entitlement reform would solve these problems rather than just imposing additional market restrictions.
That makes sense. Certainly here in Reaganism, we can get a lot of head nodding with those recommendations. Mark Andreessen was at our recent Reagan National Economic Forum. Of course, viewed as the father of the internet and leads Andreessen Horowitz, one of the leading venture capital firms in the country and the world. He had the following observation, which sort of hits on this discussion, at least one piece of the discussion. I'd love to get your reaction to it. Andreessen said something to the effect of, technology, innovation, American entrepreneurial spirit has brought down costs everywhere it has touched. 3 areas it has not touched in our economy, according to Andreessen, go to the heart of the American dream. This is what he said. Again, I'm not a direct quote, summarizing. 1 is housing, 2 is education, and the 3rd is healthcare. So those 3 things have come to define the American dream. You get a home, you get educated, and you'll be able to afford or receive medical care. All 3, sort of innovative effect of American entrepreneurial spirit, and has just not penetrated those areas. What does that mean for pharma, and how does that connect, at least in the 3rd category of healthcare, to some of what you're writing about?
Yeah, I actually would flip it around a little bit on Andreessen, because there have been great innovations in all these areas. In school, we have great new educational methods. and great new technologies. Similarly, in housing, we'd be able to bring the actual building costs down if you take away regulations. And then healthcare. I said we're in the midst of this biomedical revolution, but we've already seen a lot of the fruit of it. But I think in all of these areas, the problem has been too much government intervention. I'm reading your friend Yoni Applebaum's book right now, where he talks about zoning laws. They starting like most bad things except for Reagan in California. They didn't exist before that, and the first one was in Modesto, California. And these zoning laws have just made it hard to build in the U.S., and that is what raises up housing costs, and that's a real problem. In terms of education, Ronald Reagan brought Bill Bennett into his cabinet as Secretary of Education, and Bennett had what is known as the Bennett hypothesis. This states that the more the government spends subsidizing education, the higher schools will charge in tuition because they can get away with it because the government is spending money on student loans and on subsidizing the schools. And we're seeing the fruition of it today. So school tuitions have gotten higher and higher and higher, even as the government spends more and more and more on higher education. So the Bennett hypothesis explains that one. And then pharma is what we're talking about today. Too many lawsuits, too much regulation, too much difficulty in bringing these great products to bear. So there's a huge amount of innovation in the pharmaceutical space, but government makes it costlier and costlier to bring that innovation around.
So what happens in the boardroom? So what does that conversation look like?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm very close to someone who's been in those boardrooms, and you know him well as well. And he's said to me, and people who I know also in this industry, say when they discuss these products, they say, well, okay, we can bring this out, but the FDA is going to take forever to approve it, and the trial lawyers could sue us to death, and we have a limited patent window. So how are we going to go about doing this? And if the drug has the potential to be an absolute blockbuster, let's go ahead with it. But if it's just a single or a double, if it's just a drug that's going to produce some profit but not a huge amount, let's not do it, and let's just invest our capital elsewhere. Maybe just in the stock market alone. I mean, don't put it in a new product because the risk is too great. And it's kind of like the movie studios, although the movie studios don't produce life-saving products. But the movie studios say, well, we're going to do a Marvel blockbuster, but we're not going to do the small single or doubles movies that you and I knew in the 80s, in the Reagan era itself. I mean, all the movies that we know that Reagan watched at Camp David, the kind of the small movies that, like the Tootsies and the moonlighting type movies, they don't get made today because they don't make enough money. But they were hits at the time. They made enough money to justify their costs, and they made people happy. And so I think we have a similar dynamic in the boardrooms today in pharmaceutical companies.
Is it a problem that we have too many huge companies, or limited? It's kind of a sort of oligopoly of major pharma companies and sort of not allowing the disruptive companies to emerge like we've seen in some other sectors that actually can change the calculus on the part of big pharma?
Yeah, I don't actually think that's it. I think what happens in the pharma industry is, like many big organizations, they get bureaucratic and stultified, and they have trouble coming up with the next new great thing. And so what they do is they see the small biotechs as their minor leagues, if you will, and they're always looking to acquire new
These are the accelerators they invest in, and they make the acquisitions and the like and adopt them.
So they're not necessarily coming up with great new ideas in the pharma companies anymore, but they are buying up new ideas in the small biotech space.
Love to get your take on MAHA. We referenced it a little bit before. At the time of recording this podcast, news came out that RFK Jr. dismissed 17 members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which advises on vaccine policy, as I understand it. He is the unconventional Secretary of Health and Human Services, to understate the matter. What does that mean for the sorts of innovation and life-saving opportunities before pharma that you're describing here in your article?
Yeah, I wonder what would happen if the Reagan Institute did a deep dive search of what Robert F. Kennedy said about the Reagan administration when Reagan was in office. So who knows what that would bring up. But in all seriousness, look, I have some sympathy with aspects of the MAHA goal. I don't know why there's so much autism in society today. It's so much higher than it was when we were younger. I don't know why we have so many allergies. I mean, there have to be some causes for this. It can't just be greater recognition by doctors. It can't just be diagnosis. There's something else going on. I'm curious as to what it is. That said, I think vaccines are one of the greatest health innovations in human history. They save millions, if not billions, of lives. And I think they're a cost-effective and incredibly helpful intervention that doctors use to stave off deadly diseases. I mean, we have eliminated certain diseases from the face of the earth. Polio is not a thing anymore when it used to kill and make many American children paraplegic. So we are better off because vaccines exist, but that doesn't mean that every way we administer vaccines is the right way. That doesn't mean you should be advocating the COVID vaccine for a young, healthy child. And so I think we need to think about the ways we give out the vaccines and administer them, and maybe the vaccine schedules. But the problem is there's such hysteria and such inability to talk between the warring camps that if anybody says, hey, let's revisit vaccine schedules, they say, oh, you're an anti-vaccine nut. I'm not an anti-vaccine nut. I'm pro-vaccine. I'm absolutely adamantly pro-vaccine. And that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. And I think
I always think about metrics here, just the baseline. I mean, I take your point on trying to have some sort of conversation within the warring camps and revisiting policies. I think that's one of the great contributions of President Trump. Both 45 and 47, first iteration, this current iteration, is just revisiting orthodoxy, and that makes people uncomfortable, and it often and can lead to bad outcomes. But at the same time, it can lead to really good things too. And I think inertia shouldn't drive the decisions we make. Common sense should, and I think that's some of what he's contributed. But in this discussion around vaccines, to me, there are two metrics that really drive why it's clear that vaccines have been good for this country, good for its citizens. It's life expectancy and it's infant mortality. The former is up, the latter is down. I mean, is it more? Of course, it's more complicated than that. But that, to me, the correlation, if not causation, is right there.
You know, you're absolutely right. Although I do worry about the issue of life expectancy, because it does seem to have stagnated a bit in the 2020s. A lot of that is due to deaths of despair and the opioid crisis. And so
like 80 years old, right? We're like hovering at 80 and it hasn't really changed.
Right. And our, I guess, comparator nations have been creeping up. There's a question, just given human physiology, how high it can go. I mean, I'm not expecting to hit life expectancy 100. Although if you do hit 50 in a healthy way, the odds of you hitting 90 or 100 are pretty high. So, but yes, things have stagnated a bit on the life expectancy front, and I think that is worrisome. But your overall point is completely right. Infant mortality down, life expectancy up, and getting rid of smallpox and polio and, for a while, measles, but other diseases like that has been a good thing for human health and good thing for America.
And then going back to pharma and quality of life that we receive from innovation and the way that pharma has provided new ways of enhancing American lives. You look at weight loss products like Ozempic. I fold that into this conversation. That seems to me to be something that the articles you read, it's only having, it's almost like a magic drug, right? It's not just weight loss, but it's doing X, Y, and Z too. Prices are high. It's going to ride that out, I guess, until the generic options emerge. But this is another example of where those costs we endure as a society really drive some benefit here. How does that fold into the conversation?
Well, I think it's an important point. And there are other drugs, too, like statins, for example. They not only reduce the plaque around your heart, but they seem to have other positive implications for reducing heart disease. So, we just don't know how all these drugs are going to play out. And I think that's what I was talking about earlier with the biomedical revolution that we could be seeing in the future. We now are in a place where we have AI, informatics, we have the unlocking of the human genome. All of these combined can lead to great new discoveries in the field of medicine. And the reason I wrote the article is because I want pharma to be able to help us just make those discoveries and lead to huge improvements in human health. And I want, and this is important, and Ronald Reagan would agree with everything I'm about to say, I want the American innovator to be at the forefront of this development.
Yes. 2 points on that. One, the American innovator to exclusion of another innovator. We need to talk about China here for a second, but before we get there, the other point is the American innovator and the American people to be the beneficiary at the lowest cost. This innovation, Tevye, should bring down costs. And I take your point you made earlier that so much of that cost is a result of red tape, government strangling and adding, and the years it takes to get through all the trials and the trial lawyers and all that. At the same time, even with all that glut, I would think that AI and some of the things you mentioned should just make this all a whole lot cheaper. Do you anticipate in this era of technological breakthroughs you've just articulated that the cost should go down substantially too because of that innovation? That's really channeling where Mark Andreessen was going the other day.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, if you just think about it on both sides. So from the pharma side, you can use AI to go through results on studies so much quicker and find associations and links that people may not have thought of earlier and do so many more iterations of trials. And I think that can help lead to new discoveries. But on the regulatory side, and I think this is important, I think Ronald Reagan would have appreciated this, is FDA is always saying they don't have enough resources. The rate limiting factor is the number of reviewers they have to go over these massive submissions. Well, you could have AI review the submissions and do them in a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost. And we could review so many more drugs. I mean, we've kind of hit the limit of the record for most drugs ever approved by the FDA in a year is about 50. Usually where it's closer to 30. Well, maybe we can bust that record and going forward approve many, many more products with AI serving as a tool to help the regulators, not replace them, but to aid them.
Great point. Let's jump to American innovation versus another country's innovation. China, of course, is a critical player here. Forget where I was listening to some conversation, I think tied to tariffs between the United States and China and the escalation, 125%. There's a reprieve now. We'll see if we go back to it. But one of the things that China was very concerned about was continuing to import innovative drugs from the United States. I wasn't aware of that it was one of the two things they really wanted in the context of this current iteration of the trade war, the second being high-end AI chips. That I was familiar with. But that's not long for China. In other words, they're working really hard either to reverse engineer or make other sorts of investments that they will not have that dependency. How does that impact this whole discussion?
Well, I think you used the exact right phrase there, which is reverse engineer. China is not good at coming up with the new innovations. Now, they're trying to get there, and we'll see with the next generation of engineers, or are they going to be in the U.S., are they going to be in China? How is that going to play out? But they're very good at imitating. It's kind of like the Japanese in the 80s at Reagan's era. They were really good at imitating our innovative products, TVs, radios, VCRs, boomboxes, etc. But they weren't developing the new technologies. And the U.S. has always been great as the innovator, as the one who develops the new technologies. Now, the question is, if we drive away the pharmaceutical industry, will another nation step up? Obviously, China is the leading candidate to do so. But there's something that is inherent in the autocratic system that makes it harder to question the authority, question the people ahead of you, question conventional wisdom, received wisdom. And the U.S. is very good at that. I mean, sometimes to our detriment, but we're always questioning, is this the right answer? Is this the right approach? And that's why our scientists are always better innovators than people in other countries, and especially people in countries with autocratic systems where you really can't question authority. So I think that's part of our special sauce. The other thing is immigration. We can bring
I was just about to hit on that
over the world. Nobody is clamoring to go immigrate to autocratic China. Nobody wants to live under their free speech restrictions and their points about whether you're in good behavior or not. People want to live in freedom in the United States of America, and we should continue to encourage it. Obviously, I, like Ronald Reagan, don't like illegal immigration, but I am for legal immigration. I'm also for tests. If you have people who are scientists, engineers, we should encourage those people above all others to come to this country and contribute their talents to continue this innovation revolution.
But even that point, which would have been conservative orthodoxy even 24 months ago, is contested in conservative spaces now. There's a point of view.
I don't mind if it's contested, but I'm going to continue to fight for it. I mean, this is.
But I'm just to outline the argument that somehow we really shouldn't have to rely on foreign talent. I think the vice president is the most, perhaps, outspoken advocate of this position, which is we don't need to import talent. Let's invest in the talent that was resident here in the United States of America, from his state of Ohio and elsewhere.
I am all for the American spirit and all for great American innovators and creators. But if you look at Silicon Valley, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, a lot of the discoveries are made by immigrants who come to America, who have that spirit of innovation and want to work to make this country better. Now, that said, I am not for importing people who have terrorist views or people who want to tear down America.
But they're not talking about that anymore. But it's the former they're saying that sort of assumption, that point of view that the brain drain the U.S. benefited from, from the 20th century and forward is something that a sort of a common good conservative who's focusing on the lower middle class American that's been overlooked in Appalachia and its surroundings really needs to be the emphasis. Let's invest in them and give them the job.
Look, I understand the argument. I just don't necessarily agree that that's the only place where we can get talent from. The great thing about America is we get talent from all over the world. When I served as Deputy Secretary of HHS, I remember meeting with the immigration minister for Japan, or the population minister for Japan. And he said, we have this problem of population stagnation. What can we do about it? I said, well, you're not going to like my answer, but you should welcome in immigrants. They don't want to hear it. Other countries don't want to hear it. Our special sauce is bringing in immigrants. That doesn't mean bringing in people who want to tear the country down. And if you're somebody who's a radical or violates the terms of their immigration, that's fine. We can revoke those. And
so Tevi Troy's view is it's not an or, it's an and the policy should reflect that.
Absolutely. And I'm all for, and I think President Trump has talked about this, having certain tests in terms of encouraging scientists and engineers to come to the country. I mean, I think that's a smarter way of doing it than, let's say, just basing it on family reunification, which is still the, you want to talk about zombie ideas. I mean, that's Ted Kennedy's 1965 idea about how to bring immigrants to the country.
I like that. Let's start talking about zombie Kennedyism instead of another form of zombieism, which tends to get bandied around here in town. I will mention that.
Let's rethink our immigration system, but it should be one that reflects the fact that there are talented people around the world, that they want to live here, and we should work to attract them.
Last question on the discussion surrounding pharma. Well, we'll exit this discussion surrounding pharma and hit on another facet of President Trump. And here I want to go to Trump and Musk. And the nexus point perhaps for our conversation around China was the day that President Trump spoke to President Xi for the first time since he was inaugurated was the day you had the meltdown between President Trump and Elon Musk. That conversation between Xi and Trump should have been the headline, should have been the focus. It had so much to do with the security and economic issues, the major security and economic issues facing the United States, yet the world was fixated on just this back and forth between the most powerful person in the world and the richest person in the world. Did that surprise you at all, Tevi Troy, and why does that meltdown matter?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that it dominated the headlines. I was on Mark Halperin's show, and we were trying to speculate on what the New York Post headline might be on it the next day. So, I think people are fascinated by this, and that's why I wrote my book, The Power and the Money, about presidents and CEOs, because people are fascinated by the intersection of money and power, by the feuds between presidents and CEOs. And am I taking a victory lap that I had some predictive power in this? I think I was right to seize on this issue back a couple of years ago and have the book come out just on the cusp of this election where CEOs played such a big role. But yeah, I would like to know more about the Trump-Xi conversation. It did get lost in the shuffle and might have more long-term impact on the U.S. than any of the fights between Trump and Musk. But one thing I would add, and this is based on my study in the power of the money of presidents and CEOs is that we've often had presidents and CEOs who've had spats, who've had fights, who've said nasty things to one another, but they often make up. And one of these examples in the book is between Lew Wasserman and Ronald Reagan. Lew Wasserman was Ronald Reagan's agent. He got Reagan his first $1 million contract. They were close friends, but then they had a bit of a falling out as Reagan's career faltered. He blamed Wasserman for not getting him good roles. Wasserman thought Reagan wasn't appreciative enough of the stuff he did get. And then Reagan becomes a Republican governor of California. Wasserman's a Democrat, so they kind of drift apart. But then Wasserman's wife, Edie, who is very smart and savvy, saw in the late 70s where Reagan was going, and she rekindled the friendship. And Wasserman and Reagan were close again in the Reagan years. And so can I see Trump and Musk having some kind of reconciliation? Absolutely, because it's part of the story in The Power and the Money that the CEOs and presidents have blow-ups, but then they become friends again, and there's mutuality of interest that's worth considering.
So I did Brett Baer's panel on his show on Fox the day this thing blew up, and we're supposed to talk about the conversation between President Trump and President Xi. Of course, that was not the focus of the panel during special report. And the question to the panel was, who's going to win here? And in my mind, the person in the Oval always will win because they sit in the most powerful position in the country and the world. What's your take, Tavi? Did I get that one right?
I have a slightly different take, although I don't disagree with you in the short term. So what I write in The Power of the Money is that in the short term, presidents have more power. There's no doubt about it. If there's a confrontation between the two while the president is sitting president, he has the advantage. But CEOs have longer tenures. They can outlast presidents. They're not constitutionally limited to 1 or 2 terms. And so over the long term, CEOs can have more power. And this is what Musk reflected in that tweet he had where he said, Trump has 3.5 more years, I have 40 more years. And so I think that's the reason why they ultimately reconcile, because both recognize that in the short term, one needs the other more, and in the long term, the other needs the one more. And so that I think is in part the story of The Power of the Money, and I think that's what made happen here again.
Better answer than the one I provide. I should have texted you on the spot. Shouldn't have waited this long. Let's go to our lightning round with Dr. Tevi Choi, author of The Power and the Money, also author of the article on the cover of Commentary magazine recently in praise of Big Pharma. Here's where we ask you once again to share your favorite Reagan book, speech, quote. I think you got a good one for us today.
Yeah, well, on the speech front, we've got to talk about his March 1983 SDI speech, his speech in favor of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And we are seeing today the fruits of that labor. Just this past summer, or in this last year, Israel, with American help, repelled 2 deadly Iranian missile attacks. If we did not have some kind of missile defense, then those attacks would have caused a lot more damage, and we would have had a much greater and much more devastating Middle East war that would have drawn the U.S. in. And Reagan said, he said in that speech, there will be risks and results take time, but I believe we can do it. And Reagan looked to the long term in terms of American innovation and what we can do over the long run. In terms of a quote, there was an idea he had that he used multiple times, which is the idea of a better tomorrow. He said in his second inaugural, we the present day Americans are not given to looking backward. In this blessed land, there is always a better tomorrow. And then he used a similar concept in his Alzheimer's letter, the letter that signaled his retreat from the world stage. He said that I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. So think about it. In those 2 moments when he's on top of the world, he just won his second election, his re-election, and he has a whole term ahead of him. He has that idea that things are always going to be better in the future in America. And then at the end of his life, when he's stricken by Alzheimer, he also has that same idea. And then just briefly, in terms of book, I've got to plug our friend Will Inboden's The Peacemaker, which talks a lot about Reagan and SDI and how important SDI and American innovation in general was to Reagan's vision of how America can win in the foreign policy arena. And he was actually right, as we did win the Cold War, in part due to the threat of SDI and the fear that the Soviets couldn't keep up with us technologically.